Well, to get a deeper understanding of this stalemate, we've asked a senior lecturer at the UK's Keele University and an expert on the Horn of Africa affairs, Dr. Awal to join us via Skype from London. Thanks so much indeed for joining us and welcome to the programme.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so a lot of people look at this issue, the dam has just been built, and might feel that this is a modern problem, but this goes back to as early as the 1950s, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a major geostrategic issue with considerable security, economic, and political implication for the entire region. But you are absolutely right. The problem dates back to the 1950s. When Sudan and Egypt entered into a treaty, a bilateral treaty just between the two of them, whereby they essentially shared the Nile water between the two of them, with a lion's share of the water going to Egypt. Ethiopia wasn't a party to that agreement. Other riparian upstream were not consulted. They were not party to that agreement. That's where the problem started. There has been considerable economic security problems in Ethiopia over the last, at least between the 1960s until early 1990s. So the country did not have the economic means to build a dam or to exploit its natural resources. When the country developed the economic means, the diplomatic tools to exploit that natural resource, planned a dam, we ended up having this major political problem. The three countries have been negotiating for the last 10 years, and they have not come to a negotiated settlement.
Some people might say that it even goes back to 1929 with the Anglo-Egyptian treaty, and it almost gave Egypt some kind of superior position on the continent over the Nile. You had Britain on the one hand saying, look, we are negotiating on behalf of our colonies in Africa, and you, Egypt, you're the other party in our negotiations. Do you think that Egypt has kind of carried almost that chosen authority from 1929 right through to today?
Absolutely, and I think one of the stumbling blocks in these negotiations is the fact that Egypt insisted on what it calls historic rights and current use. These are ideas that are recognized to a certain extent in international law, but Ethiopia as a country from where some 80% of the water originates was not party to that treaty, and therefore was not bound by that treaty. While countries have the right to exploit, the sovereign right to exploit their natural resources within their territories, there is an expectation that they act with due regard to the interests of countries downstream. And Ethiopia, from my understanding, and I've been following this for the last 7-8 years at least, have consistently said that it has no intention of harming Egypt, but the two countries, for a number of reasons, have not been able to come to an agreement. So the problem is not really Sudan, because Sudan stands to benefit from the dam, as the dam regulates the flow of water and reduces flooding, which significantly affects Sudanese farmers. But it's Egypt that is insisting on its historic rights, which it was given as a result of that colonial treaty, which did not include upper riparian countries, including Ethiopia, from where some 80% of the water comes from.
I mean, what these treaties sound like, it's almost like the UN Security Council, that it was formed at a particular time in history where certain powers could make those decisions. The world has since changed significantly. So have the countries along the Nile that are dependent on the Nile as a resource, and yet they seem to have no voice. This surely is not sustainable.
Well, I mean, the UN situation as an international organization, most countries would actually want to join the UN, although some of the treaties and agreements that have made some significant decisions that would affect everyone in the world have been made by those who constituted the UN in 1945. Most states found it to be in their interest to join the UN and accept those obligations that have been entered into before they came on board. But this particular situation is different in the sense that we're talking about a country being able to exploit its own natural resources on its own territory. And you have a treaty signed or entered into by colonial powers, considerable period of time ago. And this country has not been consulted. It is not a party. It does not have any obligation towards these other countries. And we have a situation where now, a country who had an interest in what Ethiopia is doing, which is Egypt, is demanding that Ethiopia should not fill the dam without reaching a deal.
Where are these treaties enforceable?
Well, Ethiopia's position is that it is not a party to this treaty, and therefore this treaty is not binding on it. And in international law, and I teach public international law, the rule is that treaties are binding only between those that are parties to it. There are certain principles in international law that require Ethiopia not to harm countries downstream, but Ethiopia's declaration consistently through this period since it started building the dam is that it has absolutely no intention of harming the interests of Egypt. I think Ethiopia understands that Egyptians rely on the Nile for close to 90% of their water needs. So Ethiopia tried to reassure Egypt, tried to negotiate, but I think Egyptian insistence on their historic right, which gave a significant amount of the river to Egypt, made that conversation very difficult. Several actors have participated in terms of bringing the two parties together, including the United States, the World Bank. The latest rounds of the talks were negotiated or led by President Ramaphosa of South Africa, who is the current chair of the African Union. This agreement, too, has not led to a final deal. So the three countries, Sudan, Ethiopia, and Egypt, are submitting, I think, right now, their understanding of where the negotiations are, what the points of agreements are, what the points of differences are. President Ramaphosa is expected to call another round of negotiation shortly.
All right. As you've just said, Ethiopia's highlands supply more than 80% of the water that flows into the Nile. One would have thought that a country like Egypt would be a bit more negotiative friendly, going with open hands to say to Ethiopia, thank you so much for the amount of water that you supply into the Nile. But this doesn't seem to be the case, and I'm at a loss to try and understand the logic that you would be more belligerent with a country that's basically you're beholden to.
Absolutely, and I think it is in the best interest of Egypt to have a cordial relationship with Ethiopia. As I said earlier, Egypt has a legitimate expectation that its interests are not significantly harmed. Ethiopia has given repeatedly an undertaking that it has no intention of doing so. Ethiopia is a country where some 65% of households don't have access to electricity, whereas Egypt almost has some 95% coverage. Now, there might be a number of other factors, but the developmental need that Ethiopia has is enormous. And while this natural resource exists within its own country, for Egypt not to somewhat understand and sympathize and reach a compromise, I think that's a bit concerning. And to be quite honest, there is not really much that Egypt can actually do by way of stopping Ethiopia from developing its resources. There is not really a practical way through which Egypt could resort to military action. Maybe it might try diplomatic pressure or using regional actors to somewhat destabilize Ethiopia. But I don't think that too would succeed, because as far as the dam is concerned, there is a very solid public support behind the government. So it's not clear what Egypt is trying to achieve in this way. Why they haven't done as much in terms of showing room and compromise, but it's not really feasible for Egypt to prevent the construction of this dam.
All right, Dr. Aloo, thank you so much indeed for giving us some illumination on a very complex issue, but I'm sure at some point there will come to some agreement, because they simply just don't have a choice. Thanks so much indeed for your time.
Thanks for having me.
All right, that's Dr. Awal speaking to us from Kiel University in the UK about this tricky issue of the Nile. Ethiopia, which supplies 80% of the water that goes into the Nile, arguing with Egypt and to a lesser extent Sudan about a dam that Ethiopia desperately needs to build its economy, but Egypt says it will threaten theirs. So we'll see what happens in the coming weeks and days, whether this dam actually gets filled.